Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture, Outreach. It's time you proved your worth. All right, so here are our weekly topics for this week. What is outreach? Why is outreach vital for archives? And what kind of outreach opportunities can archives take advantage of? So we'll start with some definitions. Always a good sort of building block, right? So according to the essay Glossary of Archival and Records Terminology, the Society of American Archivists, outreach is, first of all, activities and programs that promote use of archives, archival resources, and archival collections, and also activities and programs that educate about and advocate for archives and archivists. And in this lecture, we'll talk about different examples of outreach opportunities that do these things, and we'll also talk about why it's important that archives engage in outreach and the importance of advocacy. And we'll also connect some of the different archival processes that we've talked about in this course to outreach. All right, and from our current chapter for this week, archival public programming is the means by which archives present themselves, their collections, and their services to their audiences. And as at least two of our readings for this week discussed, the way that archives present themselves is just incredibly key for how the public and stakeholders perceive archives, and that's something that we'll also talk about in this lecture. Okay, so I do want to connect outreach to the different types of curatorship in archives that we have discussed. So again, creation by the individual traditionally named as the curator, creation by communities to which curators belong, creation by custodians, creation by archivists, creation by activators. So sort of focusing on this first three here. So creative impacts that take place before archives typically work with records. It's interesting to think about how the history of a collection could be the subject of outreach. So if archives can provide researchers and the public with sort of the story of how records formed and maybe how they came to archives in the first place, that could be a pretty compelling story. We've also talked a fair amount in this course about how it's important for archives to work with these creators before records come into archives in order to make it more likely that the records that archivists end up collecting and providing to researchers are going to be as useful as possible. So records that have appropriate contextual and content information that archives can use for a variety of purposes, again, in the hopes of providing researchers with collections that are actually useful for the purpose that researchers need to make of them. And this relationship is unlikely to occur unless records creators value and respect archives. So why would you listen to someone, or why would you invite someone into discussions about how you're taking care of your records unless you feel like that person is associated with an important institution or is engaged in an important act? So how people perceive archives is going to make it more or less likely that they are going to be willing to listen to archives and accept archival intervention in the care of records before records enter into archival custody. And again, this can have a big impact on how useful the records that archives ultimately collect can be to researchers. So, it's a pretty important thing that people understand archives and respect them, so that they are willing to welcome and accept this sort of earlier intervention, which can be quite valuable. for archivists and researchers. Looking at the creative role by archivists, this can be something that that archives can highlight in outreach. Just describing all the different activities that archives engage in, and making sure that people are aware of them. And we'll talk about this more later on. But oftentimes people might not be aware of the influence that archives have on records and the role that archives have in providing records to the public. And so, it's just important that archives highlight this creative role and make people aware of the fact that records just don't come in and they're sort of immediately available, but there are all these steps that archives need to engage in between those two processes, at least typically, and that these processes that archives engage in to make records more accessible are valuable and important. It's also interesting to think of outreach as a creative act itself. So how does outreach shape the perspective of records that researchers have? How do they shape what researchers think of a collection or think of collections within, or think of records within an archive? And I think that this can be a pretty influential act when it comes to framing this perception. So if a researcher sees that an archive is promoting a certain collection or a particular set of records, maybe records from a series of collections or records related to a particular topic, then they may think, wow, these are really important records. These are maybe the most important records related to this person or the subject that an archive has. And it may lead to researchers choosing to access some records as opposed to others. And that can be something that can shape, how people perceive collections within archive. It may lead them to choose to work with certain records over others, and that can have some implications in things like the formation of social memory as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide, so I won't belabor the point too much, but outreach can definitely be a creative act by archivists. And then we can also look at creation by activators, or the researchers that go in and use archival materials to create whatever product they're working on or to solve whatever information need they are using archives to solve. So a really great thing for archives to do is to highlight the uses of archival research and the products that result from those uses. So if a researcher comes in and uses archival records to, say, write a book or create a documentary, that's a really great thing for archives to promote and highlight so that the public and stakeholders are aware of the role that archives played in helping, a movie get made or a popular book be written. So, the uses of archival products can oftentimes be the best promoters of archival services and the best demonstrations of archival value. Okay, so generally speaking, outreach can highlight two particular things within an archive, either the collections that the archive has or the services that the archive provides. And so sort of tied in with this discussion is which collections are archives highlighting and how are they highlighting them? Which services is an archive highlighting and why and how are they highlighting them? And I think also it's important to consider what's the thought process behind these two questions. So archives are choosing to highlight this collection. Why are they choosing this particular collection? Archives are choosing to highlight a collection in a particular way. So why are they choosing to highlight a collection in a particular way? And again, the same with services. So, which services are being highlighted? So why? Why are these services seen as being more valuable than other services? And why are they being promoted in a particular way? And I think you can look at a few different considerations when answering these questions. So maybe when you're thinking about which collections is a archive promoting, well, maybe there are collections that have a particularly strong connection to the mission that an archive has, or a particular connection to stakeholders that can influence the resources that an archive has to use in the future. And maybe the archives perceive certain records as being more valuable than others, and so that determines which records archives are going to highlight in outreach activities. It may be that there is some kind of connection to events or anniversaries going on. So in the very article, the exhibit that the author discusses is focused around Black History Month. So it makes sense that the archive would promote collections that have some association with Black history, right? Maybe connections to social issues, maybe connections to local history, maybe there is some kind of unique content that the archive has, like artifacts or something that they want to highlight. So there are a whole different, or a whole host of considerations that might determine which collections an archive highlights, right? And, ideally this is being done with forethought and it's being done in a transparent way, so that there is some kind of justification for why certain records were highlighted and promoted as opposed to other records. Because, it's really, pretty dubious from an ethical standpoint and from a standpoint of social responsibility if archives choose to highlight and promote collections that maybe only promote a certain narrative, that they marginalize and exclude records from a particular community or from a particular perspective. And so, it's just good that there's some, deep thought into which collections archives are saying these have value, we're going to promote these, and these other collections don't have value, so we're not going to promote them. And this question of how is an important one to consider as well. So, how are we promoting our collections? How are we promoting our services? And again, I think that, there are a few different considerations that should go into play here. So what is our audience? Who are we trying to reach with this outreach activity? Is it an audience that typically uses social media or typically uses a particular type of social media? Should we be on TikTok? Should we be on Instagram? Should we send out newsletters to people that maybe aren't as adept at using social media, and they're kind of used to getting their information in a different way? So again, the how should strongly be formed on the audience that you're trying to reach, and how, at least according to your best guess, that audience tends to come across and interact with information. So yeah, audience should be a big driver for really every outreach decision that an archive makes. And of course, that goes back to thinking about who is your audience and what is the best way to reach them, what is going to be the most effective means for influencing them and getting them to support archives and value archives. Okay, so we'll talk about some different outreach types. So exhibits, which of course the Barry article touches on. Exhibits can be a great way to demonstrate the value of archives and the importance of archives. Certainly social media is one that a lot of people associate with outreach. So, having stories about a collection on Instagram, putting together some TikToks. I see a lot of archives and libraries on TikTok these days. So that's certainly a pretty common type of outreach that archives engage in. But there are some others that are maybe less thought of as being types of outreach, but can be very important and even more important than social media and exhibits. So the thing about social media and exhibits is they tend to be broadcasted towards more of a broader audience. So, you put an exhibit out or social media out and it's just like, hey, whoever happens to come across this, that's fine. But there are other more targeted types of outreach which can be just as, if not more effective. So instruction can be a big one. So frequently archives are asked to go into classrooms and talk to different classes and different types of students about how to use archives and how to use primary sources. So this is a type of instruction that's a little more targeted, but it can be a great way to demonstrate to students, and it may be instruction for a group of genealogists or a community group. But it's just a great way to get in front of people and talk about archives and talk about how to use archives and really help them feel more comfortable with archives and maybe develop more of an understanding of why archives are important and how they can be used. Another really effective type of outreach is just one-on-one meetings or interactions with people. So this can be especially effective for stakeholders who maybe have some role in determining the resources that an archive has. So just sitting down with the provost of your university, sitting down with someone in a senior role within the company that your archive is associated with, and just having conversations about sort of what value archives are bringing to the table. And again, these are typically going to be very targeted. So you're not just going to take the time to have a one-on-one with someone that probably won't be able to help your archives in the future, but someone that you feel is going to be able to influence the success or failure of your archives down the road. And so you just want to make sure that you are having one-on-one meetings with them to convey the value of archives and why archives are important. Another interesting type of outreach is collaborations. Or are collaborations? Well, collaborations. And obviously this is something that the Barry article talks about, this situation where there actually was a lot of collaboration that developed this exhibit. And then, upon review of the exhibit, people realized that it maybe didn't have the appropriate tone or the appropriate sensibility towards the subject matter that the exhibit was discussing, and so sort of additional collaborations took place, and that allowed the situation to be salvaged and the exhibit to actually be respectful and reflective of the content of the collection that the exhibit was related to. So the Barry article argues that collaborations are an essential part of outreach, and that archives should be engaging in collaboration throughout the process of working on outreach. Anytime that you can get an additional perspective, an additional understanding of how you can convey information within your repository to the broader public, that's probably a good thing. It's helpful to have another pair of eyes, another perspective to make sure that you're conveying what your archive has and how that could be used, understood in a way that is socially responsible, that is ethically responsible. And what's interesting to also think is that collaborations can be a thing that can appeal to stakeholders. So if you can say to the provost or the the head of your department or your unit, hey, we put this exhibit together and we really made an effort to include all these different people and perspectives within the university or within our company, and we kind of went the extra mile to make sure that we did a great job on this. That's something that can reflect really well. People really value kind of collaboration and multidisciplinary approaches these days, and so these collaborations can really demonstrate that kind of synergy, to use a very corporate-y word, is taking place. Another type of outreach, which is one that I touched on during our discussion of researcher services, is researcher services. If you have reference staff that are really great at responding to researchers, if you have online access and online, digital records that are really useful to use and easy to use, then that can paint a really good picture for your archives as well and can help people understand and appreciate the value of archives. Of course, all these can be a double-edged sword. So, to go back to the Berry article, there was a time where the exhibit about the Morant papers that was going to be presented to the public might have been, perceived in a very negative way because of the sort of neutral, you know, distant tone that the exhibit took towards the idea of people being enslaved, so that probably would have not been a great thing, right? And it would have opened the archives to a lot of criticism and a lot of, bad publicity, a lot of bad press, which archives obviously want to avoid. If you go into a one-on-one meeting with someone and you're not prepared, you don't really know what their interests are, you don't really know how to communicate to an individual the value of archives, and you just kind of have the wrong message, and the meeting sort of falls flat, then that can be a big black eye for you. Collaborations may not go well. The people that you try and work with may walk away with sort of a bad view of archives. I talked last week about how researcher services can sometimes not go well. So, if these things aren't done well and they aren't done with the audience in mind and, with the types of content being used in mind, then there's a lot of room for failure as well as room for success. So just an important consideration. Okay, so some questions that can be associated with outreach associated with the different content and services that an archive is promoting and how that content and or services are being promoted are how do people perceive archives? Sort of what perceptions do they have, and how can we influence them? What do people understand about archives? Maybe people don't understand anything about archives, so it's important for us to start by promoting the services that archives provide and helping people understand them more, understanding the creative role that archives take in making records available to the public. A big question that outreach should address is what value do archives provide? And we'll talk about why that's important here in just a minute. Which archival services are important to the public? It may be that there are services that archives provide that are just more understandable and more and resonate more to the public. You can tell people, well, we engage in appraisal and arrangement description, but that's probably not going to have the same weight as if you talk about the role that archives play in preserving records or helping people use records. So again, just a way to think about what you're promoting and why you're promoting it. How do people interact with archival services? So where's kind of the meeting point between researchers and between archival records and archival services? Oftentimes this is going to be in the area of reference requests in online access. So again, there's a lot of opportunity there for archives to paint themselves in a good light, or again, paint themselves in not such a great light. And just overall, who should outreach be geared towards? Who is it essential for us to reach? Who is it really valuable for us to influence and have some connection to? A lot of these questions can be answered through having researcher data or potential researcher data. So knowing who has used your archives in the past and what they value, sort of what they've used, the experience that they've had, and also thinking about who isn't using your archive and what might they value and what might they find important, and how can archives sort of communicate to people not using archives why archives are important and why archives should be valued. You know, if you're an archive and you just sort of reach out to the same audience over and over again, then there can be a lot of missed opportunities out there for you to communicate to and work with um, different communities that maybe you haven't worked with in the past. Um, but again, knowing who you're trying to reach and why you're trying to reach them can just be so important. This is something that the Pearson article mentions on page 106. So the author mentions when targeting audience with more of a business orientation, value words with specific relevance to them may be used. So if you again are trying to interact with someone that has more of a fiscal mindset, to maybe put it politely, then they're going to value different things that archives provide, and they're going to need to have that value communicated to them in a way that might be different from someone who is just interested in protecting records and preserving history, and might have other sort of motivations and priorities. So all these questions that outreach asks can really be solved again by having just a knowledge of who you're trying to reach out to, who you're trying to influence, and that's a starting point for an outreach strategy that can be very structured and goal oriented and is more likely to be successful. So centered around the concept of outreach and why our outreach is important is this idea of demonstrating value. So something I've already touched on in this lecture, but I just want to highlight it because it really is the essence of why outreach is so necessary. Generally speaking, people are not going to perceive something as being valuable unless they understand the way that it benefits their lives. And because of that, it's important that archives increase an awareness of the archives, of the services that the archives provides, and also increases an understanding of those services. And unless that happens, then people just aren't going to value archives. They're not going to understand why archives are important, and the perception that they have of archives is not going to improve, and they're not going to be more willing to support archives. Now, obviously, there are people that are willing to support archives already, but even their perception of archives can be enhanced, and maybe they're more willing to support archives once they really have an understanding of the value that archives provide. But again, there's this foundational level that's needed of just an understanding of what archives do and why what archives do is important. More of an understanding of the complexity and resources that are involved in the different resources and services that archives provide. And archives are the people that are the best people to communicate that information to the public, to potential stakeholders, and are in the best position to demonstrate the value of why archives are important. And again, the idea is to improve this perception of archives and at least ideally increase the resources that archives have to work with in the future. And this perception is just so important, and this is something that the Pearson article for this week talks about. So on page 96, the author talks about how the perception of the archivist persona becomes a way to justify, reinforce, and perpetuate misunderstandings about the value of our work as professionals. So if people have a poor perception of archives, then they're not going to understand why archives are important and why archives deserve to be supported. On page 97, the Pearson article talks about a need to craft a value message. So, a strong, unified message of why archives have value, why archives should be supported. And again, this is what outreach is geared towards, and this is what archival outreach should accomplish. Again, assuming that it's done well. On page 99, the Pearson article talks about how part of this value message should include transforming this idea of the passive archivist into a more creative role. So if you think of the Patterson article, where the author discusses some of the sort of imagery or depictions of archivists that people have, introverted, working in a basement, dusty, that's not a perception that is going to encourage people to support archives and value archives, right? And the Pearson article talks about how no archives need to represent themselves and communicate in a way which says we're not just passive, introverts, but we do have an active role in shaping history. We are involved in all these different services and processes. And this is the value that we bring to society, to our organization, and so on. The Pearson article really focuses on the way in which archives market themselves and the words that they use to describe their work and impact. And this is a really important consideration. If you are using words to describe yourself as a profession that reinforces this perception of archives as being passive or not really having much of an impact or not really providing much value to an organization, then that's going to be the understanding of archives that people walk away from. That's going to be the perception of archives that people have. So it really becomes a question of how are archives going to present themselves to the public? Are we going to present ourselves like this as a profession that is active, that has a creative role in shaping history, that engages all these different processes that have value and have worth, or are we going to allow ourselves to be perceived as something like this? A distortion of the active role that archives have, a perception that is similar to some of the different descriptions and imagery that the Patterson article uses. Working in dusty shelves, just a very unflattering portrayal. And again, it really is up to archives to determine which depiction of archives people have or which perception of archives people have. Typically, people aren't going to advocate for archives unless archives first advocate for themselves and help people understand why archives are valuable. And again, that's why outreach is so important, because obviously this picture of archives and this perception of archives is much more beneficial for archives and more accurate than this one is. So I've used the word advocacy and advocate a little bit, and it's something that the definitions that we looked at earlier on touch on as well. So just to sort of place the idea of outreach within the context of advocacy. So, outreach occurs, it demonstrates the value of archives. That can lead to increased use by the public or by specific individuals, and that can improve an archive's ability to advocate for itself and improve the ability of archives to get others to advocate for it as well. So again, outreach is kind of a fundamental part of this process. Unless people understand why archives are important, unless they value archives, they're typically not going to use archives. And that's really going to hinder the ability of the archives to advocate on its own behalf and to get others to advocate for the archive. So again, a really foundational act for archives. The Berry article advocates that outreach be considered a core and fundamental part of archival activity, and I couldn't agree more, because so many of the different processes that archives engage in result on resources that are only going to be gathered through advocacy. So, appraisal takes resources. It takes resources to have the time and effort to have an understanding of the value of records and whether or not they should be brought into a repository. Online access takes records. It takes resources. It takes resources to buy software and server space and things of that nature. Arrangement and description can take a lot of staff time to be accomplished, especially for larger collections. Preservation can be very resource intensive, depending on sort of the level of preservation that's being done. Reference, again, it takes staff time and staff energy to do well. And none of these things are going to be given to archives unless they advocate on their own behalf. And this advocacy is going to be impossible unless people understand the value of archives through archival outreach. The Pearson article talks about how sometimes archives are perceived as being nice to have but expendable in times of economic stress. And on page 98, the article stresses the need for archives to gain recognition as essential programs. There's always a competition for resources, a competition for dollars within any organization. And, these resources aren't just going to be given to archives. And if archives don't engage in outreach, if they don't have people advocating on their behalf, if they're not able to advocate for themselves, then the resources to engage in all of these different and important processes that archives engage in are going to be few and far between. And that's really going to hinder the ability of the archive to be successful. And what can happen is that if archives don't have the ability to carry out these processes in a satisfactory way, then that can really hinder the ability of the archives to attract more researchers and have more people using their materials, which can make it even more difficult for the archives to justify its value and improve the perception of the archive. So the best way for archives to demonstrate their value and to gain advocates is by being competent. And competency requires resources, right? So if archives aren't careful, they can find themselves in this death spiral where they're unable to do a good job, and that hinders their ability to demonstrate their value and to advocate on their own behalf or gain advocates. And that can further diminish the resources that an archive has to carry out its activities in a professional and efficient manner. So, the only way to stay out of this death spiral is to think of outreach as a core activity that archives engage in, to carry out outreach in a systematic and planned way, and to have a very strong understanding of the importance of outreach and the necessity of carrying out outreach, again, as a core part of an archive's activities. So next we'll talk about some of the connections between outreach and a few of the different archival processes that we've touched on. And I'm using this to, again, sort of broaden your perception of outreach and talk about how each of these activities that archives engage in can be opportunities for outreach to take place. So we'll start with outreach and appraisal. As I've talked about in this course, appraisal is sort of the heart of archival activity, and appraisal can be a great way for archives to engage in outreach. So just through the process of working with donors and showing them that you care about their collections, that you want to learn more about their collections, that can certainly lead to good word of mouth that will maybe result in other donors also donating their materials, which can benefit your archive. I talked about collaboration. Collaboration is certainly something that can be involved in appraisal. So if you as an archive are interested in a collection or interested in a subject area, but you don't really have the expertise to maybe know who are the most important people to collect, or what are the most important events or organizations to try and acquire records related to, why not find a scholar who specializes in that field and say, hey, what do you think? Which which donors should we really be focusing on? Or we have this collection that's been offered to us. Why don't you take a look at this inventory and tell us, do you think that this is really a good collection that reflects this person's life or this event well, or is it just a bunch of fluff that really isn't going to contribute very meaningfully to the understanding of a person, place, or event? So there are tons of opportunities for collaboration to take place during the appraisal process. And again, this can lead to more people sort of wanting to work with archives and know more about archives. And it can have a lot of positive long-term repercussions for an archive. Okay, next we'll talk about preservation. So I touched on instruction as a possible outreach activity that archives engage in. A lot of people understand preservation, and a lot of people understand the connection between preservation and archives. So instructional sessions where archives are working with members of the public to increase an understanding of how families or different communities can preserve their records so that they're going to survive longer and be accessible for a longer period of time. That can be a great instructional topic that archives can really dig into. And again, something that a lot of people can understand and relate to pretty well. So that would be a great opportunity for this type of outreach to take place. And we've talked about the importance of archives working with records creators prior to records being donated to archives to make sure that records are in as good a shape as possible when they get to archives, so that archives don't have to, try and rehabilitate them, or archives aren't bringing in a bunch of records that have accessibility problems. And that collaboration with records creators and records custodians through the lens of preservation can be a great outreach tool as well. And you can make the same argument for digital preservation. This collaborative process that we've talked about can be a great means of outreach, a great opportunity for outreach. Digital preservation is an extremely important process that archives engage in. I don't know that it's necessarily understood as well by the public and even by stakeholders as maybe just regular preservation. People may not understand the technical infrastructure and the complexity that is involved with digital preservation. And so this can be a great way to highlight an important and complex and involved process that archives engage in, to make people aware of all the resources that are involved in digital preservation, and to make the case for why digital preservation should be supported. So, this is a service that archives engage in that can definitely be highlighted and says, hey, archives involve technology too. It's not just shuffling boxes. There are all these different processes related to preserving digital records, and that's a great way to demonstrate the value of archives. Again, the connection between outreach and research or services, anytime you can help a person find information that they're looking for that may change their life in a positive way, that can definitely help people value and appreciate archives more than perhaps they did before. And if you're able to compile reference statistics and other information, sort of analytical information about the services and value that your researcher services are providing, that's certainly a good thing to pass on to the provost and say, hey, look, we answered 50 reference requests last month, and we had an additional 5,000 people visit our online collections, and that's a great way to demonstrate the value of archives and why archives deserve to be supported. And the last one that I'll touch on is outreach and social justice. So something that we haven't talked about as well, but certainly archival involvement with social justice issues, at least to the right audience, can be something that demonstrates the value of archives as well. So if archives are taking active steps to document marginalized communities, to make sure that every aspect of a community or of an area is being represented through archives. If archives develop exhibits that address social justice issues in a responsible way, then that can be a message that's really appealing to not everyone, but most people, I would hope, and that can be a really powerful way that archives can demonstrate their value and can improve the perception of archives as well. So if you are a member of a community and you're really concerned about segregation and inequality in your community, and the archive has an exhibit related to the history of a group within your community that has been marginalized in the past and probably is to this day, then that again can be something that is a very appealing message and a very appealing service that an archive is providing. Now, this one might be, again, more divisive than other archival processes that I've touched on. There are always people out there who, oh, you're woke, you're a social justice warrior, or whatever kind of negative connotations they have with social justice involvement. And I think for that reason, this has been something that archives have shied away from just a little bit, although perhaps less and less as time progresses. So you just want to consider your audience and consider your stakeholders and consider, who you're trying to reach and influence maybe a little bit more carefully when you are really promoting your archive's social justice efforts. But again, if you are connecting your social justice efforts with the right audience and with the right community and with the right stakeholders, it can be a compelling message that archives can make, and again, one that really demonstrates the value of the services that archives provide and the collections that an archive has. Okay, so that's it for our discussion for outreach. I hope that this discussion and the readings for this week has broadened your understanding of what outreach is and can be, has helped you understand more why outreach is important, and just ways that archives can go about convincing people that archives are important and archives deserve to be supported. I feel in my heart of hearts that a lot of people do value archives and the general mission of archives, but I don't necessarily think that they understand the complexity and the importance of different processes that archives engage in. And again, it's up to archives to communicate this message, because it's a fool's game to expect people to advocate on your behalf and to expect that you can just kind of sit back and think that resources and adoration are going to come to you as an archival institution. So, you always have to be active and engaging in very structured and goal-oriented activities to demonstrate your value and to improve the perception of archives that people have. And it has to be done continuously, and it has to be done, every archivist has an opportunity, and I would argue an obligation to communicate the value of their work to the public. So it's just a very important process that archives engage in, and I hope that you have more of an appreciation for the value of outreach and the role that it has in the long-term health and sustainability of really every archive out there. So as always, thank you for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions, and take care.